to welcome you to the 29th Annual North Idaho College Popcorn Forum Series, and our topic is Journey Through Time, What Happened in the Western World in the Second Millennium. We started on Monday morning, and we're having a tremendous week, and I think what lifts my spirits most of all is the quality of the presenters and the attendance by you in the audience. For the last 3 or 4 years, we've really been breaking records for our attendance, going up each year, and certainly Monday through Wednesday we've had great audiences, large audiences in the auditorium in the morning, and here we had set up 150 chairs and it was not enough, and today we added 50 more chairs and had 185 people at the afternoon panel. We want to first of all thank the Idaho Humanities Council. They have given us a grant now for 4 consecutive years, which I think is unusual for the organization to be so supportive for so long, and we're deeply grateful to them. And I think they've given those grants because of the quality of people that we've been able to not only bring here from other places in the United States, but also the work of our local people in the panels. And Dr. Clay Jenkinson and I have had many talks about our celebration of the quality of work and performances by our local community people and the college individuals that have performed at this series that we've been doing. Before I introduce the program and the panel that we have this evening, I want to recognize in the audience Susan Jarvis King, who will be performing tomorrow. She's a dear friend, and let's give her a welcome. I saw in her such incredible talent last year when she did Dorothy Parker, and I don't know when I've had a day that I enjoyed so much to moderate that wonderful panel with her and Mark Twain and Will Rogers. I lost control for an hour and a half, and with the humor and the spirit and the spontaneous way that they went about the program. And she'll be here as Eleanor Roosevelt tomorrow. I want to also, before I forget, say thank you to the Associated Students of North Idaho College. The student governments have funded this program for 29 years. They're number one. They've been funding longer than anyone, and we're grateful to them. And also to the college for the Convocation Series funds. And finally, the North Idaho College Foundation, which has also been very supportive of our work. And last but not least, all the members of our team. It's a very, very large team. And as I go around the country, people say, how can you do that at North Idaho College? And I said, it's the team. And they're every component. Those people who work on staff, grounds, and people who work in Student Union, Dean Bennett, who is in charge of our technical facilities here that we use, and our television staff, and our auditorium staff, our drama department, our art department, the committee of the convocations and the popcorn forum, and our faculty that so supports it with the students coming, and the list goes on. And everyone has their role, and they play it to an ultimate perfection. And that's the only reason it succeeds. Tonight's program in this third day has to do with the subtopic, the world of religion, philosophy, and art, the Protestant Reformation, and the fracturing of Christendom. Today we heard from Dr. Martin Luther and his role in the coming of Protestantism. He's returned this evening and will be on the program. We also had a panel this afternoon that was extremely powerful, and one of those people that was so powerful was a priest here in Coeur d'Alene. Father Roger LaChance did Pope John the 23rd, one of my heroes, and he was very powerful in showing the change that took place through the leadership of Pope John the 23rd, and those were just examples of what happened. Tonight we're very fortunate to have 2 panel members who are great contributors to our community. They're both here to be in character. I will recognize who they really are very, very briefly, but I hope you will get into the frame of mind that that's not who they are this evening. They have changed to be someone else. And I hope in relation to your questions and your comments that you will assist them in staying in character. And I'm going to introduce one at a time, and when that presentation is finished, then I'll introduce the other person. Our first presenter on the panel this evening, and when they all finish, the good news is you'll have a lot of time for interchanging with them, is Reverend or Father Bob Hazreith. He's with St. Luke's Episcopal Church here in Coeur d'Alene. In addition to that, I'm proud to say he is a board member of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, representing the religious community. That is one of the designated seats on the board. And Father Hazries does a lot of work in human rights as well as many other areas. You will find in him lots of humor. Some you will understand and some you probably won't, from my experience with the Father. But he's here tonight as Jonathan Gutenberg. He was very gracious to do this, and we're going to go back in time and listen to Mr. Gutenberg as the publisher of the Gutenberg Bible. Mr. Gutenberg lived from 1400 to 1468. He has come to share his message with you in 1999, at a time in which he is unfamiliar with our ways of life. But would you join me in welcoming Mr. Gutenberg?
None of you would be here tonight if it weren't for me. You all consider yourself intelligent, well-read. And I provided the books that you read. Without me, they wouldn't have been made. I'm not well known. I've been stolen from. I have every right to be bitter. But I'm not. I worked hard to accomplish the printing press. So you think. The Italians worked harder. And all I did was develop what they had already done. They pressed olives. And I just took their wooden press for olives and made it into a printing press. Simple. Then came the hard part. Hard work, imagination, political intrigue, but a lot of artistic satisfaction. I can't hear you. I began as a goldsmith in a small town, not so small. It was small only because I came from a patrician family. And it was not appreciated by the family that I associated with the guilds. We were supposed to just pay the guilds to do the work. But the family didn't like it, which made me feel even better. Too bad Freud's not here to anticipate that. The intrigue between the patricians and the guilds and some of the politicians in our community made me move during the time I was trying to work. But before I moved, I had the support of two friends, financially, and some of the patrician friends of the family. And we began to develop a type to print. We had to mix our alloys. We had to mix our metals and our leads together. And it worked much better than the old-fashioned, wood carved. It does help to drink, to see upside down and backwards. That's what you have to do to make this. It took a lot of hard work. I had a young friend who worked with me. We developed this in our imagination and in our drinking together. And we did after our goldsmithing days. There are 2 5-year periods in my life that no one knows anything about. During those 2 5-year periods, I worked the hardest. They thought there was an apparent silence or I'd been on a long drunk. Not so. We found the press was easy to make. The type was much harder. Other people wonder about the tray. They think that that was easy to make. You know, that you put the type in? It was not easy. You have to get the right angle so it'll all stay in. And then the graphics that went into our Bibles, those are pictures, the graphic pictures, not just the letters. We put graphics in our Bible. And it helped illustrate the Word of God. We're not supposed to be theologians. They are. But to print the Bible, you have to know the Word. And you have to know Latin. So we're just poor lay theologians. The family, friends, were not enough eventually. And so I got the backing of a banker. You know how that can be. They charge interest. And I'm a slow worker because I'm a perfectionist. And as a result, they foreclose. And they took away my press and all of my type. After we produced the first 2-volume Bible. A second set was even better. Not only did he foreclose and take all of my press and all of my type, he took away my friend. Together they produced the second and what they thought was better Bible. I could feel sorry for myself, but I don't. Because I kept a better set of print, of type. And I produced calendars. You know, they sold better than Bibles. I produced some other books too. In fact, in addition to the 2-volume Bible, I produced indulgences for the church. It kept the church in business a lot longer, you know. But the thing that gets most overlooked is I produced an encyclopedia. And those of you who are students will really appreciate that. One little overlooked thing. I had developed, my friend was not around when I did this, interlocking type, so that they were like chips hooked together. And if you think for a moment about interlocking chips, understand that in your day there's a thing called computer based on the principle of interlocking chips, right? Interlocking print. Well, they didn't know anything about me doing that. I kept it a secret, and it made it a much better encyclopedia book. Now, regardless of your ideological speculations, which I understand happen in every generation, never forget us. In the work that we did, we were artisans. Never forget that we were also inventors who have made your dialogues possible. We don't claim much. We did retire into oblivion. But our work lives on. Thank you.
We apologize for the terrible noise. There's something in relation to the new system this is a beautiful building, but that's one of the things that we don't know what's happening. At least I don't. Our second panelist this evening is another person like Father Hazries that's a great cement to this community, Norm Gissel. He is an attorney He's also a board member of the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, and has been on that board since about 1984, and the organization was founded in 1981. He spends over half of his time helping others and working for good causes, and when he has time, he practices law. He really, truly is committed to this community. He's here this evening, as he has been in some other years, to portray someone that he admires in history. And of all people I know, this man reads more than any other person per week. I asked him to do a character that he was very delighted to do. And let's move back in time, and let's meet Stephen Langton, who was an English archbishop, a historian, and was the major drafter of an extremely important document called the Magna Carta in 1211. This gentleman lived from 1115 until 1228. Let us hear him, and please welcome him to our time in history, Stephen Langton.
Be seated, my children. I see that you follow the great American custom of being seated around religious royalty. My name is Stephen Langton. I am the Archbishop of Canterbury. I have a difficult time living in your century. The lady right there in black tried to give me a very familiar kiss before I came down. I'm unfamiliar with being kissed by women, as I am celibate. I'm also unfamiliar with the humor of America. I asked somebody for an example, and I heard about Dorothy Parker as the lady out there, Dorothy Parker, and I asked, well, what's this Dorothy Parker? And this person told me a Dorothy Parker story, and Dorothy Parker mentioned that if all the girls at the Yale junior prom were laid end to end, she wouldn't be surprised. As an archbishop, I don't understand the reference there. I was a cleric in a time when it was important to be intelligent, and it was important to be a good public speaker, and you could, in the religious times of that day, rise on your own merits, and I was an excellent example of rising on my own merits in a religious setting. Of course, at that time, the only church worth knowing about, and the only one that we really appreciated, was the Catholic Church. I was, in my reign and in my religious capacities, I was dean at the University of Paris. I was the canon of the city of Paris. I was chancellor at the University of Paris and dean at the school in Reims. Pope Innocent III learned of my great scholarship and my great ability at public speaking, and he invited me to Rome, and shortly after that, around the turn of the century, I became a cardinal. And as a cardinal, I served him for a period of time, and subsequently became Archbishop of Canterbury. I want to talk a little bit about the 13th century and the first half of the 13th century so that you can understand the historical significance of the Magna Carta and other charters that were passed at that time by King John. One of the great chroniclers of the 13th century was a man named Matthew Paris. He was a monk in England, and he wrote copiously about the events as they occurred, and he regarded the first half of the 13th century as the most dynamic and the most exciting period in world history since the death of Christ. At that time, the Mongol hordes were proceeding eastward through Russia, and with great success. Also at that time, we were sending Christian crusades towards Jerusalem, westward. It's been observed that if the crusades would have been a little further north and the Mongol hordes would have been a little further south, they would have met somewhere in Czechoslovakia, killed themselves, and the next 1,000 years of world history would have been much more peaceful. But that was not what happened. It was a very significant time in world history. The economics of the feudal system as it was getting started was a very dynamic period. It was a time when the royalty, and particularly the kings, were seeking more power administratively as well as through sources of revenue. And it was a great period of time of expansion of the Catholic Church. My predecessor was a man named Hubert. He died in 1205. And King John observed at that time that he finally, upon the death of Hubert, would truly be the King of England, because Hubert exercised great control over John at that time. The monks at Canterbury, feeling the weight of John descending upon them at midnight on the day of Hubert's death, voted to send a monk named Reginald off to the Pope. They had elected him as their representative to be elected as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now they said, be very modest till you get to the Vatican, and then you tell Pope Innocent III that we have nominated you. Well, as soon as Reginald hit the French coast, he started bragging about this wonderful new role he was going to have in the religious world. The monks at Canterbury grew upset at that, and they nominated a second man, John Gray, and they sent John Gray back to the Pope to be as their person to be appointed as the new Archbishop of Canterbury. And so they were both back there entreating to the Pope to have each one of them be nominated as the Archbishop. And I, as the shining bright new cardinal standing there with a giant grin on my face, volunteered, and I, in fact, was the one that was selected. And this was much against what John wanted, the king at that time, because the kings want influence on ecclesiastical matters as well as secular matters. And John's wishes were ignored at that point in time. So there was this tension between myself and John right from the very beginning. It was said by one chronicler of my history that I, upon entering England and assuming the role of the Archbishop of Canterbury, that I joined the baronial party. That's not quite right. There were no parties, particularly as you folks in America today would understand that. There were a number of interests to be served by obedience to the king. There were a number of interests to be served by friendship and collegiate relationships with the knights and the royalty that were directly below the king. I naturally associated with them because at this time, as I was becoming the Archbishop of Canterbury, John had lost a war. Now you must understand that England in those days is not the England that you and I understand as an island state separated by the English Channel from the rest of Europe. Normandy was a part of England. And we understood that we had a physical presence in what you now know as Europe, and we also had a physical presence in the island of England. And we did not understand that there was this dichotomy, although there was this channel that ran between the two parts of England. We understood that there were the two parts of England, and we equally identified with both. What happened was that John, through magnificent ineptitude, succeeded in losing Normandy in a battle with the French. And he's back on the island, and he is searching for more money because he's now broke. And as a matter of fact, the island nation of England is now broke. And John tried many different ways, unique and unusual, and in a very predatory way, to raise money to finance another battle on the French, what you call the French coast, which I would understand is the part of England called Normandy. Historically, as I indicated, we were in a expansion of government, both ecclesiastically and in a secular way, particularly by King John. When you need more revenue, one of the things you have to do is go to the people that are going to pay that revenue and accommodate them in some other fashion. You have to give them something in order to receive something. John fought this and was very angry about this whole concept because he was very concerned about his image as king, and he was very concerned that he was there by the divine right of God himself. So the knights and the royalty and the earls and the barons of England grew very angry and very upset, as well as the merchant class of England grew very upset with John. And there was actually a civil war in progress around 1215 when the Magna Carta was signed. And earlier than that, there was a tremendous conflict between John wishing to exercise control over ecclesiastical matters and people like myself, who was in charge of expanding the interests of the ecclesiastical court in opposition to John's interest. Now, before we get to the Magna Carta, there's an interesting document that was signed by John a year earlier, and it has an enormous amount of significance, and it's really largely ignored in history and the chronicles of the history of England. And that was that John signed a document that granted free ecclesiastical elections in all of England for all of those abbeys that are not directly owned by him, which means essentially that he had to keep out of the elections that took place in Catholic elections in the country of England. It's a remarkable concession by him, because one of the ways you exercise power as a king was to assist in or to directly appoint religious figures within your community. And so there, the idea of universal suffrage occurred in the common law of England. And also, what else occurred was the beginning of the separation of church and state, which became known ultimately as the First Amendment to the United States Constitution in its clearest and most dramatic statement. The enormous pressure, now we'll go to the Magna Carta, there was enormous pressure on John to make a variety of different concessions. And we all met in 1215 on June the 21st in Runnymede, which is a little short ways from Windsor. And in a place where other charters, interestingly enough, had been signed by kings. And I was there kind of as an intermediary, but I was actually there boosting the chances of the barons and trying to bring down and to control this out-of-control king and his rapacious need for tax money. Now and he signed this under great protest. And one of the things the barons and I insisted on when he signed the Magna Carta was that we hold in hostage for a period of time the city of London itself, as well as the Tower of London, so that we formally, the barons, formally occupied the city of London and the Tower of London for, I think it was 8 months, to make sure that the king himself would honor the charter. Because how they would always get out of charters before was they would say, I signed this charter under duress, so therefore it's of no valid concern of mine. And then they would just throw it in the dustbin of history, and off they'd go, and the kings would do anything they wanted. We wanted that not to happen. Well, shortly after the king died. The king died shortly after he signed the Magna Carta. And Henry III took over. It was his son. And he was a very young boy. And when he was a young man, we had the regents ratify this charter and modified it in some few particular ways. And then when he became of age, we had him ratify it again. And what the barons and I decided to do at that time was that if you kept having the royalty re-ratify these charters, this idea that they were signed under duress would have less and less political value. We understood that we were engaged in a historic enterprise with respect to this one king and with respect to this one country. We thought that there would be peace in our community and peace in the land of England if this charter were passed. We did not realize the enormous impact historically that the Magna Carta would have. We did not sit down and visualize that the Magna Carta would be regarded as one of the foundation documents of all constitutional democracies. And we certainly didn't realize that somebody by the name of Thomas Jefferson, a good many hundreds of years later, would articulate this ridiculous notion that all men are created equal and they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We had no such idea in those days. And in fact, biblically, Mr. Jefferson, with all his good intentions, was probably wrong. Martin Luther himself, as I see into history and I see that the tragedies of which his generation of religious scholars brought upon this world, I am greatly concerned. We had one concept of God. Now there's, what, a dozen concepts of God since you came around, Martin? It's changed things dramatically. And whether it's for the best or not, I don't know. But instead of having one Christian religion of which we could all subscribe and which the interpretations came from wonderful people like myself, or whether there's this Protestant religion in which everybody gets a chance to build his own religion around whatever it is he believes is central and important to himself in the Bible, I don't know historically whether that was a very good idea or not, but we do know it occurred. But in essence, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. All right. Thank you very much.
I sense from that we'll have some great debate and dialogue in a few minutes, and you'll be a part of that. We have two scholars with us this evening, as I indicated, and both of them are highly qualified, and we're excited for them to be here in Coeur d'Alene at this forum. First of all, we're going to ask a response from a very famous person in history who spoke to us earlier today. We have with us Dr. Martin Luther, who lived from 1483 to 1546. As you know, he was a German theologian, a major leader of the Protestant Reformation, often called the father of Protestantism. The Lutheran Church is named for him, and he may speak to that issue in a moment. He held a doctorate in theology from Wittenberg, received in 1511. He posted his famous 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church at Wittenberg on October 31st, 1517. That date is still celebrated as the time of the birth of Protestantism. He was the author of books, hymns, tracts, treatises, biblical commentaries, and translation of the Bible into German. He is really well known in history, and we are pleased that he would come from that period in history to visit us in 1999 and make a statement in response and be available later for questions. Join me in welcoming Dr. Martin Luther.
My goodness, after having listened to the Archbishop of Canterbury, I wish the Reformation had happened 200 years earlier. Clearly, Mr. Gutenberg is one to whom we are all indebted. His movable type made the Reformation, of which I was a chief proponent, extremely important. As most of you probably know, books up to the time of Mr. Gutenberg were produced by hand, usually by monks. It's no wonder they were called fleas on the coat of the God Almighty. There were so many of them producing manuscripts. In any case, ideas traveled very slowly before Mr. Gutenberg's time. The advent of movable type made it possible for the ideas which were being circulated at the time of the Reformation to be quickly disseminated, debated, and revised. So to you, sir, we thank you. We are deeply indebted, and I'm glad you were able to drink beer and do type. As to the Archbishop, I find the involvement of churchmen in politics to be an odious thing. There are two kingdoms, as we all know. There is the kingdom of Christ and the church. There is the realm of princes. And the realm of princes is a realm in which churchmen have little or no business. It is, of course, the duty of all Christians to be obedient to the state. Sometimes that is a difficult thing, but a Christian must believe that even bad rulers rule for reasons that God alone can know, that nonetheless are good and valid. I myself had as little to do with politics as was absolutely possible, although I must point out to all of you, it is because of Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony, that I myself survived after the Diet of Worms declared that I should be put to death. Frederick hid me in a castle called the Wartburg. It was there that I translated the Old Testament from Hebrew and Latin into German. And of course, I think this is one of the most important points that I can make tonight in relation to the Archbishop. Each of you is your own priest. You do not need bishops. You do not need supreme beings in the church. Each of you, given the Word of God in a language that you can read, are a priest who can interpret the Bible as correctly and as truly as anyone in the Archbishop's position. This concept called the priesthood of all believers has passed down in time and is one of the main things that was accomplished during the Reformation, of which I was one of the chief proponents. But here again, let me say, I did not set about to reform the Church of Rome. It came about quite by accident. Despite my own development of theological ideas, the thing that convinced me that I needed to nail 95 Theses to the castle church door in Wittenberg was the fact that a monk named Johann Tetzel was touring Germany selling indulgences, those odious documents that Mr. Gutenberg also printed. Indulgences, document which, for a fee, provided that you or any of your forebears, living or dead, could find their way out of purgatory. Tetzel sold indulgences using a jingle that sounds almost as though it could come from modern advertising. When the coin in the coffer clings, the soul into heaven springs. Well, who among you would not want to nail 95 Theses to the castle church door saying that there is nowhere in Scripture that the practice of indulgences is authorized? But clearly, when a church is so heavily politicized, it has needs for gold almost as great as the king's needs. Those are the principal areas in which I would like to respond. I know Mr. Jenkinson now would perhaps like to respond from a more contemporary perspective.
Our fourth presenter this evening is someone I have known for a long time, and it has become a practice in the spring of each year for him to be back in residence where he belongs at North Idaho College. He's a very, very great friend, and I have learned so much, and I've grown so much intellectually because of my friend. Dr. Clay Jenkinson is here this evening, not as he often is as Thomas Jefferson, but he's here as Dr. Clay Jenkinson. But let me say for history, and as it's being recorded this evening by video, that Dr. Clay Jenkinson is one of the founders of the modern Chautauqua movement. I would say he is the modern founder. I know of no one that understands the Chautauqua movement better than he. He began to experiment with first-person historical characters in 1976. He's developed a renowned reputation in doing such people as Meriwether Lewis, Thomas Jefferson, and John Wesley Powell, but I've seen him do all of those. To show his great brilliance and his success, he received in 1989 from President George Bush the Charles Frankel Prize, and it is the National Endowment for the Humanities' highest award that they can give. Dr. Jenkinson holds degrees in English from the University of Minnesota and was selected to be a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University, where he received a degree in Renaissance English, literature, and theology. He has taught at a number of schools, and he has performed over 1,000 times in the role of Thomas Jefferson. Most recently, he's been recognized nationally for his work and being covered by such fine media events as C-SPAN. But what's most important about Dr. Clay Jenkinson is he is so committed to the scholarly work that he does. And I am so fortunate to know what I believe is a true Renaissance man. And I'm so grateful that he likes us so much that he continues to come to North Idaho College. And he and I already planned next year's popcorn forum, which will be in March the year 2000. And it's going to be on the 20th century. I use this opportunity every year to announce what we're doing next year with Dr. Jenkinson. Tonight he will be in the role of Dr. Jenkinson, and he's got a freewheeling opportunity to talk about and respond to this and other things. But before I do bring him to the podium, you must not miss tomorrow when he will join Susan Jarvis King as Eleanor Roosevelt and Dr. Harry Fritz as Abraham Lincoln for an hour and a half. What a treat. And then at 10:30, and they'll return at 1 o'clock to be with you on a panel. I also want to say that Dr. Jenkinson is being taped for a movie on Thomas Jefferson, and the crew here, you might be discovered tomorrow as the cameras roll. Give a real warm welcome to my friend, Dr. Clay Jenkinson.
Good evening, everyone. It's such a delight to come back to Coeur d'Alene and North Idaho College. I have two visits per year which I count on now. One is at a little Benedictine college in New Hampshire, where I get a kind of Catholic Benedictine retreat, and then here in North Idaho, and I'm not quite sure how to characterize it, but it's something that I greatly enjoy. I don't need to tell you how fortunate you are to have Tony Stewart in this community. There are very few things that would occur that require only one person to be the pivot, but if Emerson was right when he said that an institution is the length and shadow of one man, certainly the Popcorn Forum is the length and shadow of Tony Stewart, and I'm immensely grateful for what you do and for, among other things, asking me to come back. Let me just say a couple of words. I expected many more historical figures on stage than are on tonight, but let me step back just a little bit and talk a little bit about the year 1000 and the year 2000, and then see if I can place these individuals before turning to you for your questions and comments. I've made a list of what's changed, or how the world looked then and how the world looks now. It seems to me that several of these characters fit directly into this pattern. But in the year 1000, the idea of human rights was virtually unheard of in the world. In the year 2000, we talk about very little else. It seems to me the Magna Carta is one of the pivotal moments in human history, and it raises several points. First of all, in Roderick Nash's book, The Rights of Nature, there is a grid, there's a chart of the widening of the rights tradition since Magna Carta. And he shows Magna Carta in the 13th century, and then the English Civil War in 1640, and the British Bill of Rights, and the Glorious Rebellion. And then as he moves along from ancient history towards the modern world, this rights tradition keeps widening. So the Magna Carta didn't accord equal rights to all, as you've heard tonight. but the Declaration of Independence at least contemplated it. And then after the Declaration of Independence comes the American Bill of Rights, and then the American Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, and then the enfranchisement of women in the early 20th century, and the Civil Rights Movement in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, culminating with the great Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965. And at the end of the century, at the end of the millennium, we're knocking on the door of according rights to non-human creatures, non-human things. There is a lively debate in our time as to whether a grizzly bear has rights, or whether a tree has rights, or whether certain pieces of geology have rights. And we've just begun to open the door to the possibility that there are rights that go beyond the human species. So think of how breathtaking that is. In the year 1000, to talk about rights was virtually out of the conceptual map of the people who lived in the West, and in the year 2000, we are quite certainly about to push through and to give legal rights, rights that have legal standing to entities that are not human. That's an enormous revolution, and the Magna Carta stands right at the heart of that. And although Gutenberg, so far as one can tell, was not particularly political, none of this could have happened without the Gutenberg Revolution. The Gutenberg Revolution is, I suppose you could say, technologically neutral in some sense, but it has increased the pace of life, and most of all, it has allowed the dissemination of ideas in a way that was unheard of in the year 1000. Think of the year 1000. If there were a manuscript of Ovid, the great erotic Roman poet, if that manuscript were to survive at all, not worrying for the moment about earthquakes, fires, vandalism of various sorts, but if it were to survive at all, it would have to have the sanction of the church. And most of what survives of classical antiquity was filtered through the church's concerns about what people should be apprehending and what they shouldn't. And Ovid was one of the lucky ones, because Ovid was capable of being allegorized by the Christian tradition. But there were other pagan writers who were not so easy to assimilate, and they disappeared, or their manuscript trail dwindled to almost none. So in the year 1000, if something were going to be a part of the canon, part of the official literature of the West, it had not only to have the sanction of the church, but there had to be a scribe, a literal being, a priest, who sat in a scriptorium and over months, sometimes years, hand-copied that manuscript and made it possible for it to live for another generation. Now think of Gutenberg. Gutenberg gives us movable type, and suddenly you can produce not one manuscript in 25 years of painstaking artistic labor, but 100 of them in a week. And now you don't need a highly trained priest to perform that task. Now it can be done by any engineer who can set type. And so there is both a loosening of the grip of the transmission of ideas in the Gutenberg Revolution, but there's also a reduction of authority, because now technicians can do the same work that previously are done by people with an agenda, people who are trained to protect, to be in a sense the priestcraft of culture. So I think Martin Luther was right when he said the Reformation is unthinkable without the printing press. The Reformation would have been a minor event, as there had been many sort of proto-Reformations in the history of the West up till that point. Erasmus, who in some regards is a more pivotal figure than Luther, because he was both a reformist and a great humanist, a great lover of the tradition of the humanities. At one point, when Erasmus was at the height of his career, it is said that he published a new book every 2 weeks for 10 years. So he's the first Isaac Asimov of the West. That doesn't do him justice, of course. He's a genius. But here is a man who was a bestseller at a time when the printing press was brand new. And the Reformation and the ideas of a more liberal, a more latitudinarian view of salvation were made possible by Gutenberg, although it was Luther and Erasmus and Calvin and Zwingli who took first advantage of that great tradition. So if the first large movement that I'm describing in the history of the millennium is the widening of the rights tradition, Gutenberg plays a role in that to a certain extent. He also plays a huge role in the second theme that I would emphasize, the fracturing of Christendom. In the year 1000, this is hopeless oversimplification, but in the year 1000 in the world of Christianity there was one monolithic church. In the year 2000, you need look at only the yellow pages of Coeur d'Alene or Spokane or Seattle to see what's happened to Christianity. It is fragmented and refragmented and fissured. In fact, what astonishes me, and I want to ask my friend Bill Crystal about this later this evening, but what astonishes me is that Christianity can said to be exist at all, given the fracturing, the fragmentation that's occurred since Luther. You might have expected just to fissure out into such tiny private sects, the Church of all believers, so that in a sense every individual becomes a sect unto himself, that it might have dissipated. What's astonishing is that it's still holding its own quite remarkably at the end of the second millennium as we enter the third. I'll just quickly go through the other broad themes because I don't want to get in the way of your conversation with these historical figures, but the third that I would point to is the rise of the Republic, the rise of the idea of self-government. Again, unthinkable in the year 1000, now universally considered, at least rhetorically, in the year 2000, and that has a lot to do with Gutenberg, certainly, also with the Magna Carta. But for people in the Enlightenment, like Thomas Jefferson and Rousseau and Montesquieu, the view then was that the modern world invented the Republic, that there really was no Republic in the ancient world. The Republic is a modern invention, particularly the idea of representation. The fourth theme that I would point to is the rise of the individual. Luther plays a pivotal role in the rise of the individual. Now, even in 1517, standing between a human being and God is no longer a church, no longer a priest, no longer a minister of any sort. Now there is the possibility of a direct linkage between the sinner and his God or her God. Again, Gutenberg plays a pivotal role in that, because I was in a Catholic church just the other day on Easter, and no Bible in the pew. You go to a congregational church, Bibles everywhere. Fundamental difference between Catholicism, at least traditional Catholicism, and Protestantism. Protestantism is made possible by the printing press and the notion that an individual can have a private relationship with God becomes possible when that individual can read the Bible for her or himself and doesn't require an intermediary of some sort. The fifth and sixth themes that I'll point to, I'll close with very quickly. One is the rise of materialism and capitalism, or the secularization of nature. Gutenberg plays a little role in that, the other two not so much. And finally, maybe the most astonishing single fact of the millennium. In the year 1000, we lived in a closed world. The solar system was thought to be a direct creation of God himself over the course of 6 days. The known universe was thought to be closed, the Earth at the center, the sun and the moon and the planets moving out until at the end of this little small solar system there was a prima mobile, a crystalline sphere that enclosed the universe, everything that there was. And beyond that there was nothing. Beyond that there was only God. So in the year 1000, the world was as tiny as our little planetary system. In the year 2000, I don't know if you saw the remarkable photograph in National Geographic last year, but there was a photograph taken by the Hubble telescope once it had been corrected. And what they did was point it into a place in the sky that appeared to be completely empty. They looked for the emptiest place in the sky, and they took a photograph of it, and then they blew it up. And when you pull this out of National Geographic, it's the most astonishing image you will ever see. It is universe, followed by cosmos, followed by solar system, followed by nebula. In every direction in this empty quarter of space, there are hundreds of millions, even billions of stars and planets and solar systems and cosmos. So think of the difference. In the year 1000, the Earth was the center of the universe and man was the center of existence. In the year 2000, what is humankind? Whatever we are, we have been displaced radically from the center of things, and we've been reduced by science into an extraordinary creature, but very few people who are not operating from a faith culture, very few people would argue in the year 2000 that we are unique, that we are alone, that we are centered in the way that we were just 1,000 years ago. So this has been a revolutionary time. It's almost impossible to come to terms with the number of changes that have occurred, but look at what these people represent. They're all from the middle of this period. Most of what we're talking about happened from the year 1450 forward. And 1455, the Gutenberg Bible, is not so far distant from 1492, the European discovery of America. The rights tradition really begins in the modern world in Florence and Renaissance Italy. Most of what we're talking about comes after the mid-millennium, and the acceleration then has been just unbelievable until the point that most of us, if we are not rooted deeply in a faith tradition, are confused, bewildered as we move from the second into the third millennium. So these are characters of enormous importance, and I think it's time for you now to engage them in debate.
You're very fortunate to be here this evening, and for you to be able to engage in the dialogue with these very, very special people is our gift to you. Before we do that, let me say that also Dr. William Crystal, that I did not introduce his background. We will let him go out of character later, and he has an incredibly impressive background also. I want to add one footnote, and that is, in addition to the program tomorrow I mentioned, you want to be here on Friday also. Clay Jenkinson agreed to do a keynote address as he did last year. Last year it was on the evolution of law. This year he's going to do a dramatic speech on Friday morning about where are we now after this last 1,000 years, and he'll be in the role of Clay Jenkinson. And then at 1 o'clock and 7 o'clock on Friday, he's agreed to do something else we've never done before. At the Popcorn Forum, we're going to take people from the first 4 days and bring them back on a round table, and he'll moderate both those round tables. What a dialogue that will be Friday afternoon and Friday evening, so don't miss it. I have one thing I want to do before we have your questions. Excuse me, something's happened to my throat today. I think one thing would be good to initiate the questions is to allow our characters in history, and Dr. Jenkinson can respond too, but if any of you would like to ask the other one a question before we go to the audience. There's been certain remarks made about you by others, and you might want to either respond or you might want to ask them a difficult question.
Unless there's a question, I have an observation that Martin Luther was a Catholic priest and was an errant Catholic priest. And he's mentioned that there was this edict that was unfulfilled, and I, as a traditional Catholic, lament all unexecuted errant priests and all unexecuted edicts. I would put it to this audience who values human rights above everything, that we waged wars in those days, and we had very civilized wars in a way, and we had a very significant, one of the few battles that the British kings were able to win in those days was one with a little over 500 men. I was watching your television the other day, and there was 400,000 men in the Russian army attacking the city of Berlin at the end of World War II. There were millions and millions and millions of people that were murdered in wars in this 20th century of human rights. And there was nothing like that when you had royalty running the political side of things and one church running the religious side of things. And put it to you, who was better and who was safer, ourselves or yourselves?
Martin Luther will want to respond.
Clearly, this is a peculiar reading of history, I suspect. I cannot speak to what may or may not have taken place in the 20th century.
I cannot even speak to what 500 Englishmen may or may not have been able to do on that vile and dingy island. But in Germany, we had no such problems. We had princes who clearly understood the right ways of governance, and who, as they were able to shake themselves free of that hideous Holy Roman Empire, began to rule their regions with great decorum and dignity.
I knew that would happen. Anyone else want to respond here on the panel? What I'm going to do, so we get everything on tape and get it very accurate, I'm going to play the role of, I guess, a television commentator. I'm going to come to the audience, and if you have a question, if you'd please rise, and we'll get it on the microphone, and then we'll have one or all to respond. You can direct it at one or to all of them. Who would like to do the first question? And would you state your name too, please?
My name's Tina. My first question is for Langton. What's the difference between the slaughter of the children during Christ's time and the treatment of the Native American people, or non-Catholic and Christian beliefs?
What is the difference between the slaughter of children when and what period of time?
During the time that Christ was said to have been born.
During
the period that Christ was said to have been born, and so they slaughtered all the children so that he would not live?
Your Grace, I translated that.
I don't.
There's no record of the slaughter of the innocents.
There's no record of that. Mr. Gutenberg, who is my loyal historian here for all of his apostasy and publishing the Bible in wildly excessive manners and way more than we priests would like, I know about that. I am concerned about when I come across groups of people who have not adopted the Catholic religion and the Catholic ways of life, because I find that it's exceedingly difficult for them to get into the kingdom of heaven, which they certainly should aspire to.
Okay, Clay, you want to respond or anything?
No.
Okay, next question. Who has the next question? You're all overwhelmed by all the information.
Well, let me ask Luther a question then while we're waiting.
Yes, please.
Dr. Luther, there's something in the history of ideas called the law of unintended consequences. Did you have any idea when you published your theses and when you challenged the authority of the Church of Rome that you would essentially be breaking the unity of Christendom and making it possible for there to be literally tens of thousands of Christian sects at the end of the 20th century?
Clearly the answer is no, but Dr. Jenkinson, I would like to point out, since a rosy picture has been presented of the monolithic Catholic Church, that there was a Byzantine Church, which I understand to this day remains separate from the Roman Catholic Church. Catholicism had already fractured. But in my case, the answer was no. I honestly believed that if pointed out, the Church would acknowledge the error of indulgences and would reform itself. It would look at the book of the Church, the Scriptures, and would see that in no way was indulgences presented, and the right thing would be done.
But how would you feel if some group of 30 people in some place in the New World decided that they understood the Word of God better than the Presbyterians, better than the Calvinists, better than the Lutherans, better than the Methodists, better than the Catholics, and they went to the edge of town and got a small building and put in chairs and began to declare themselves to be more in tune with God's principles and God's purposes than the great traditions that you represent one branch of?
Well, clearly, if they are using the Holy Scriptures as their guide, then it would be very difficult to quibble with that philosophy. I'm not so sure that it would be my purview to question what they were or were not doing. It would certainly be the princes to decide whether another sect would be permitted within the principality. I myself feel that as long as a group is studying Scripture and adhering to it, that it is difficult to question the idea of what they're doing. As I've suggested earlier, there is the priesthood of all believers, that each and every person is his or her own priest, standing in direct relationship, as you pointed out, with Almighty God.
We have a question back here.
I'm Janelle, and I have a question for Mr. Gutenberg, and that is, who could read your publications once they were printed? What was the rate of literacy at that time?
It was increasing greatly, and that's why we were doing it. We could produce 400 pages a day once we had our type set. And the patrician class all read Latin, but there were schools being established at the time. And as a result, the underclass, the craftsmen, the artisans, were becoming quite literate. And that would be a thing I think you could also address to Dr. Luther. That is that why is it they had table talk that he directed and laid out interpretations, where when we published Bibles for the church, as well as indulgences, people just simply read it. They were learning their Latin.
Dr. Luther, you want to respond?
I would disagree. I think that Latin was in fact the language of the church and the language of the patrician classes. It was not something that ordinary people were learning in sufficient numbers. That was why the translation of the Bible into the vernacular was such an extraordinary thing. If I'm not mistaken, in enlightened England, when William Tyndale did that in the 15th century, he was burned at the stake, was he not?
That's correct. People did get crossways with our church from time to time.
And clearly my own translation of the Old Testament first into German and then later the New Testament was an extraordinary and radical thing, because ordinary people did read the vernacular, whereas only the learned folks tended to read Latin.
Which did you depend upon more, the Hebrew or the Latin?
We have a question right here.
I would like to ask Mr. Gutenberg, my name is Harry, how you can sleep at night having invented a process that allowed for the widespread dissemination of scurrilous and destructive literature that was subversive of all received notions of wisdom and order. You, sir, are responsible for the handbasket that the world has gone to hell in.
Are you referring to my encyclopedia?
No, sir, I'm referring to the process that you invented that allowed for the dissemination of that scurrilous literature.
Oh, it's not, you don't condemn the creator, you condemn how it's used.
You're getting off the hook, is that?
Yes.
Is that your response?
Well,
you're disclaiming all responsibility for the mess you created.
What you do with the creation,
response.
what you do with the creation, if you look at the illustrated Bible that we did, and there are 40 copies still in existence, you'll see that it's what we depicted in those pictures, what creation did with what the Creator provided was what needed to be condemned. And thank God the church put that straight, Your Grace.
Other questions? Here's a couple here.
My name is Irene Curran, and this is a great opportunity to find out how did this press work. I can't visualize it. Did you carve little numbers, letters individually and put them in a channel, or were
Yes.
they whole words?
No,
and then
no,
did
no,
you
no.
stamp each page 400 times?
Yes.
That's how it worked?
But you had to do it, you had to get your lines laid out. The problem was the number of letters on the page, across the page. And we settled on 51. We at first had fewer, and that was going to use up more paper. We also used then a different type of paper to produce this, because it had to carry the ink. It made a much clearer impression than the old wooden carved print. But to make them interlock was the real trick. And that's one of those 5-year periods where I was missing. We were working on the improvement of the print itself and how to interlock. and keep it in the tray, then press down.
Yes, my name's Vivian Ward. I was wondering, Mr. Gutenberg, did you remotely foresee the extent to which the printing press and the speed to which the printing press would revolutionize the civilized world?
No, we were artisans, and I think that's what I left you thinking, is that artisans and craftsmen have intellect. That's where the emphasis I wanted to make on the caricatures that we made, the print, the graphics that we put in the pages is overlooked when you think of the printing itself. The graphics that we use in these pages amounted to our theology.
My point exactly.
Yes. We had no idea. We knew that we would be making a lot of money once we got the job done, because the patrician class, as was pointed out by another member of the audience, it was going to pay the money for it. Unfortunately, in my case, my creditors did not want to wait long enough for a good job to be done, my problem being perfectionism.
My name is Bill, and I'd like to ask Reverend Dr. Luther a question. If I'm understanding some of your comments, I thought I heard you say that you had observed in the Catholic tradition an emphasis on having an intermediary between individuals and God, or between the community and God, and that was a superfluous accoutrement. I'd like to ask how you might reconcile that observation with the early Christian tradition, which had a pretty big emphasis on individual development towards a relationship with God through prayer, fasting, almsgiving, and meditation. Seemed to be quite a lot of folks who developed and grew based on their individualized relationship with God. Could you comment on how you might reconcile those two observations, if I understood you correctly?
Indeed. I don't think those are exact opposites, frankly. Thank you for calling me to my feet so that I get an opportunity to say to Mr. Gutenberg that a wealthy printer is certainly an oxymoron in any age. But to return to your point, I certainly believed in prayer. My catechisms take seriously the model of prayer, the Lord's Prayer. They're included in both the large and the small catechisms. Prayer is an important arsenal in the Christian's own life. I didn't think the two were exclusive. However, prayers to saints or other intercessors seem to me an unnecessary thing. With each and every person, his or her own priest, it is unnecessary for anyone to stand between us and God. Jesus had done that for us once and for all, and because of that, we clearly have our own individual relationships. That's the second, I think, major tenet of my theological teaching, this idea that we are justified by grace through faith, that we have been put right, not by virtue of anything that we did or have done or could possibly do, but by an act that took place in Jerusalem, well, in this time, nearly 2,000 years ago. Does that answer your question?
I'd like to respond too, if I could. It is just this sort of apostasy with which we have to be so cautious. The reason why that we have such a mediator or an intercessor between ourselves and God is to emphasize the majesty and the known and the unknown and almighty God, and that it is presumptuous for us to directly address ourselves and our petty concerns to our God. Look where Luther's ideas have gotten us. A number of years ago, one of your religious icons, Tammy Faye Baker, on national television, called on God to assist her to be the co-chef in making up of a tuna casserole. That she was not struck dumb and deaf with lightning bolts is a sadness on my part. But it goes to show how this idea that you can have direct relationships with God and that you don't need an intermediary, how that has trivialized and essentially makes a foolishness of the worship of God.
Clearly, this is what I would expect of someone wearing a surplice and other ecclesiastical finery, implying that he is better than the rest of us. We all are our own intercessors. We stand ourselves before God.
Other questions? Any other questions? Yes. I want to, and I'll introduce Hugh Smith, and he played Adam Smith, and he did a great job this week as Adam Smith.
Thank you, Tony. This is for Martin Luther, and you were very critical of the selling of indulgences in your time, and you presented a little jingle to us concerning that. If you could transpose yourself into our present society, what would be your stand on some of the methods used by some of the clerics today in raising funds?
Not knowing nearly as much about your culture as I need to answer a question like that intelligently, I can only say that Tetzel offered a model which is apparently still very much in use. Some of the slogans that one sees from time to time on church reader boards, certainly not on a local Episcopal church reader board, make one wonder if there has been any progress on that front since Tetzel's time.
Other questions? I have one back here.
It's been said that a moral man takes responsibility for the consequences of his actions. I'm just wondering how you feel about the Peasants' Uprising in 1524, and the question goes to Martin Luther.
Thank you very much. I considered myself to have taken a middle path, a path between papists, Babylon I used to refer to it frequently as, on the one hand, and people who were more radical on the other. I called them Schwärmer, people of the sort of man that Thomas Müntzer was, who was clearly one of the people that you are considering when you talk about the Peasants' Uprising. I was and have been called a theologian of the magisterial Reformation, which is to say that I felt that the lawful rulers of my region were, in fact, ruling because God intended them to rule, and that even a bad ruler ruled for purposes which we may not presently understand at God's behest. The peasants' revolt challenged the lawful authority of the princes in those regions, and while they looked to me for guidance and support, I could not give it to them. I think one need only look to the Apostle Paul to realize that princes are ordained of God and rule because God chooses to have them rule, and that when one challenges that authority, one is no longer following the Word of God.
Another question? Anyone else?
Well, what do you do then with Paul saying that you respect the just demands of those in authority over you? And those in authority over you are making unjust demands.
Is this coming from Mr. Gutenberg, who's had one beer too many?
It's coming from another catechism is what it's coming from.
We have time for one more question because I want them to go out of character for a few minutes too. Anyone else? One more chance. Are we here? We go.
This question is for Mr. Gutenberg. Kathy Beck. Mr. Gutenberg, your invention truly has revolutionized the civilized world during the last 550 years. But it would seem to me that at the end of the 20th century, through modern technology, including television, radio, the internet, CD-ROMs, that your invention is about to become obsolete. Would you agree, and how does that make you feel?
As I alluded to earlier, if I understand the principles, and I'm just not too clear about this computer thing, but I think it's based on linking chips. And I don't know where you would be without it. No inventor, I think, would want to think that this is the end product. We were simply trying to devise a way to make the Word of God known and accepted in a faster way than manuscripts, which as Martin Luther said, mistakes can be made in recopying. We know that. We've compared copies. One monk gets it this way, another monk gets it a different way. And then what Martin Luther does to it, get us a third way. And then we get bishops and archbishops and cardinals and their interpretations. So we didn't mind. The printed page in itself, we've got to remember, is a word is a symbol. And it's going to have to be presented in different ways, different means. We don't mind that the books are going to now be somehow speedily sent overseas. That's fine. But we got it started.
One footnote I would like to make, and then they're going to go out of character, which is a very important part of the Chautauqua movement. There are some people listed on your panel that aren't here this evening, and that's due to such facts as sickness. You might note also that one of them, Amelia Phillips, that does Charlotte Spears Bass, who was a political activist and the first African-American woman to run for vice president, has been moved to tomorrow's panel, so she will be here tomorrow for you who are anticipating her presentation. I'm asking the presenters to do two things. Although I introduced both Norm Gissel and Father Hazards before, to introduce themselves again and tell us a little about themselves, but most important of all, as you have portrayed the individuals you have, and this is something that's really meaningful to me, when you do a character and you study them for several months, what does that do for you? How does that change you? How does that affect you? And I'll get you going by saying I talked to one of our characters today who, you know, is Linda Erickson, who is not doing someone this year. When she did one character, she worked on it a year and read 30 books to prepare for that. I want you to get the idea of how hard they work. And so with that footnote, Norm, would you start and tell us what it means to you?
Right. Well, this may be a surprise to some of you that don't know me. I'm not a Catholic, although I certainly respect all of the religious traditions of which now reside in America in various forms and fashions. What became clear to me when I was studying up on the Archbishop, and I spent a lot of time reading about Martin Luther, and it occurred to me that powerful people can change politics in a country, but it's great men that change culture. And in our own ways, both of us, but certainly Martin Luther more profoundly than the Archbishop, changed culture forever. And that's a measure of his greatness that he was able to do that. Certainly, as Gutenberg was merely an inventor, but an extraordinarily ingenious one, and he also changed culture and sped up the life for all of us. And as the lady mentioned about all these other things, it occurred to me that TV and radio and the internet are really all children of your invention in the first instance, and then that we have rearranged pixels and dots and pieces of energy, but they essentially remain the same based upon this ingenious format and the even more ingenious invention of the olive pressers. All right, but I thoroughly enjoy this marvelous to go into character and to try and understand the historical consequences that flow about an important person, and to try and put yourself, and I was right there at Runnymede in the weather, out in the open, urging this awful king to put his seal to this important document. And when you do that, you understand history in a fresh and invigorating way. And as an amateur historian myself, it's a great thrill and pleasure to be part of the Chautauqua process. And these two gentlemen to my far right here are just marvelous human beings to give their time and their intelligence and their years and years of research to us.
Norm, you've also said to me that when you read a book to play a character, you read it very differently than if you're just reading it. Would you explain that quickly?
Yeah, I was doing another English historical person, and it gave me a sense when I read history. You know, you read this thing, when you try and understand the character of the person, because you know you're going to have to stand before a crowd and talk as though you are that person, you are investing in that reading in emotional energy that's completely different than the typical reading of history. If you read something about General MacArthur, it would be an excellent Chautauqua person. To read about him, there's enormous amounts of information about him, is one thing. But to try and become General MacArthur as you're reading the history of General MacArthur is quite another experience altogether. Maybe I'll be a General MacArthur someday. I'd be a great...
We'll hold you to that. Father Bob Hazard.
What I discovered, a couple of things. The more recent history, and I've got to express gratitude to David Remington in the NIC library that just collected too much literature for me, out of books, off of the internet, and then said, here, and you better get started. He played Scott Joplin this morning. The latest information on Gutenberg is that he did not die poor. He did hold back. He did keep something back, just enough equipment. Did put out an encyclopedia and some calendars. He did not die poor, as a lot of earlier scholars thought. So that was a surprise. The other thing that impressed me in the part is that he was a very humble man. I don't know if it's an accident of history or just his own attitude, but there's very little recorded about him. It was in 1908 that they found, his interlocking type. And so if that had been found sooner, linotype would have come sooner, the computer would have come sooner. As I understand that, how those things work. And I'm asked my wife, not mechanical. It was a difficult thing because, as my friends will tell you, I have a large ego with a small self-esteem. I'm anything but humble.
One more thing. How does playing a character affect you?
That was hard, to be humble. I can say that there have been signs of growing humility in my character personally in the last year. I'm 58, nearly 59, maybe it's age. And I think having to do this has promoted that growing sense of humility within me personally.
Thank you. Also coming out of character is Dr. William George Crystal is the senior minister of the First Congregational Church in Reno, Nevada. He comes to us with impressive credentials he wouldn't mention, so I'll mention them to you. He holds a BA from the University of Washington, a Master in Education from the University of Washington, a Master in Divinity from Eden Theological Seminary, and a PhD, and I believe that is History, from Johns Hopkins University. And as Clay Jenkinson told me, he is a great performer and a great scholar, and so we're delighted having to share. I just enjoyed immensely his work today, Dr. Crystal.
As those of you who were at the program this morning heard, I portrayed Martin Luther because they asked me to be John Calvin, and I said no one will be John Calvin because he never said anything funny. I want to do Luther. He had a sense of humor. It didn't come out too well, perhaps, in this evening's forum setting, but Martin Luther was a human being, a flesh and blood human being, but an extraordinary man of principle. I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said that there are great people. I think Luther's greatness was just believing so strongly in his theological interpretation that he wouldn't back down, he wouldn't deviate from it. For those of you who ask questions, sometimes when you're in character, you hopefully you're answering as the character and not as yourself. These are not necessarily my views across the board. But Martin Luther was an extraordinary human being who lived a life that is not all that different from the lives that many of us live. At an early age, he thought that God was reaching out to him and shaking him. He entered a monastery. He then tried to make sense of that experience that he'd had when he was young. He didn't make very good sense of it for a long time, particularly within the parameters that were available to him in his youth. The theology of the Roman Catholic Church at that time said that good works and acts of contrition, penance, propel you heavenward, which meant that you had to figure out every little thing you either did or should have done and didn't do, identify it, confess it, and then you'd be okay. Well, Luther realized this was an impossibility. I really identify with Luther at that point, the idea of trying to be, such a good human being that God will possibly want to save you. As Luther discovered, that isn't possible. We're saved in an entirely different fashion. He found tremendous psychological relief. Erik Erikson, the psychoanalyst, wrote a wonderful biography of Martin Luther called Young Man Luther. It's really a model, I think, of psychoanalytic history. But Martin Luther then, having gotten on the outs with the Roman Catholic Church, excommunicated, certainly something he never intended, protected by Frederick the Wise of Saxony, was able to marry, something that would not have been possible for a priest in that day and age under any other circumstances. So at a rather advanced age, he has a family. And I think a lot of what he did theologically was developed in the context of his family and understanding how children learn, and it's really good pedagogy. Luther's an extraordinarily good character to perform. I don't know how Luther changed me. I think that's really a hard thing to guess. Actually, I'd go back about 6 years. Clay really is the one that changed me. I was a one-time Chautauquan, and he needed a villain in the following year and suggested that he invited me out to lunch. Don't ever go out to lunch with Clay, Tony. He always wants something.
I've experienced that several times.
But I became a second time and third time and who knows how many times Chautauquan. So I'm grateful to you for that. And it's wonderful to be here. What a great place. The audiences here are extraordinary. I've done enough Chautauqua to know that in a lot of places people are not nearly as interested, are not as willing to try to pay attention to presentations which sometimes are dense. And it's really been a real pleasure to experience such wonderful, attentive audiences and such great questions. This morning, little kids were asking the most incredible questions. You were there. Wasn't it amazing? Just made me feel really good to be here. Thank you very much.
Give him a hand. Dr. Crystal and I just having a wonderful day, and his wife, Mary, is here, and we're delighted that Mary is here from Reno. And I said something to him today when he complimented you, and I said Clay Jenkinson deserves a tremendous amount of credit for this, and he's been here twice in January to train, and Clay, we've had raving reviews of the panel this week, and from that training, they're getting more and more sophisticated. But I also told Dr. Crystal something else. After 4 years of this, the audience is very sophisticated. That puts pressure on the presenters, but also helps them know that you understand what they're doing. And even when they're in character and they say things you may not agree with, you take it in that light, and it's a learning process. We're going to close this evening with final comments from our friend Dr. Clay Jenkinson.
Well, first of all, I want to say I really enjoyed your performances, and I really love to watch the process. I come here in January to help train the Chautauquans. They hardly need any training from me. They have Tony calling them day and night for months to get ready. But I want to say something about what you saw Bill Crystal doing tonight. Notice, if you've been following the questions, most of the questions invite the scholar character to project forward to a world that she or he did not live to see. And this is very dangerous business because, after all, Martin Luther's been dead for a long, long time. And if he actually were airlifted into the 20th century, he would probably just have a massive nervous breakdown and shut down entirely, as would any historical character. I mean, electric light, imagine the concept of electric light. Imagine a GPS satellite unit, or a television, or radio. Any of these concepts is just beyond the ken, beyond the fundamental matrix of these minds to understand. And so when we ask a character to come out from the historical milieu and to address us, there's a lot of danger involved in that, because they're bringing their ideas and their vocabulary from the past. And surely, if Luther were here today, or Thomas Jefferson were here today, or Gutenberg, they would see the world differently from the way that they did. and yet we're constantly asking them to affirm us or to comment upon us. What I liked so much about the way Bill Kristol does this is notice when he was asked those questions, it's not that he was unwilling to deal with them. That wouldn't be good Chautauqua. But he made it clear that he wanted you to remember that he was a figure from the 15th century and that he didn't feel particular competence, and he tried always, and did very successfully, to keep his answers within his own time and place. And I think that's the key to a successful Chautauqua, is projecting forward very carefully and making sure that you remind the audience again and again that you're speaking from your time, your place, your ideas, your cultural context. And I think Bill does that as well as anyone can. I think that's extremely important. Bill said no one would ever be stupid enough to do Calvin. I'm here to tell you that's not true. I did Calvin once. I was quietly going about my business. I got a call from a presbytery in Iowa, and they said, come and do Calvin. We've heard you do this interesting Jefferson. Would you like to do Calvin? Well, I had to say yes, because my actual training as a scholar is in the Renaissance, in theology. And so I thought, I'll never get a chance to talk about something I know again. I'd better say yes. So I agreed. And I spent months. I read a dozen biographies of Calvin, and I read his Institutes in 7 or 8 of its forms, and I read his extant correspondence and commentaries and tedious theological studies of double predestination and so on. And so I went off in great glee, because this would be 1,000 Presbyterians in a giant church in Des Moines, Iowa. I thought, if ever there is a captive audience for John Calvin, this will surely be it. So I got in there, and I told the story of Calvin through Calvin. Well, if you know the history of the Presbyterian Church, the modern doctrine of Presbyterianism and the modern social feel of Presbyterianism could not be farther distant from John Calvin. Essentially, modern Presbyterianism has distanced itself as ruthlessly as it possibly could from Calvin's doctrine. So when I stood up and said to them that they all deserve to be damned, that not one of them, not the saint in the group, deserved to be saved, and if anyone was saved, it's not from merit, it's from God's capricious grace reaching out in his infinite wisdom and mercy, possibly to take the worst person in the room and save him, but that everyone who was damned deserved it and everyone who was saved didn't deserve it, and so on. I was enjoying this immensely, and then I looked out and there was just a sea of hostility and bewilderment and people shaking their heads and saying, is that our tradition? So that was my one and only Calvin. I think you made a wise choice in choosing Luther instead. But let me just end on a slightly more serious note. One question that we've raised is whether the age of literacy is over. 1455, the Gutenberg Bible. I would say yes and no. I don't myself believe that video, CDs, the internet are necessary extensions of the Gutenberg Revolution. I think this is a new departure, and there's every chance that Gutenberg's world will be left behind. From my own experience of a teacher, I can tell you that I think that in some regards the age of the book is over. If you are a college teacher, you know something of what I'm saying. A few years ago, I taught a course at the University of Nevada of 250 sophomores. And I decided, just for fun, this was an American Traditions course, I decided to teach Faulkner's Light in August. I had never taught Faulkner's Light in August before, but I read it over the summer and was amazed by how brilliant it is and how many interesting issues in American culture it raises. So I decided we'd been reading Frederick Douglass's autobiography and the Declaration of Independence and the Federalist Papers, and relatively straightforward books. And suddenly we were going to face one of the great texts. It's one of the dense, beautiful, multi-layered, rich texts of the 20th century. And so to prepare my students, I said, look, this isn't going to be that easy. You're going to have to contemplate spending between 20 and 40 hours in the next week to read this novel. And the minute I said it, I realized I had made a ridiculous and stupid mistake. Even though I had underestimated the amount of time that would be required, when I looked out, I saw almost like a wave at a baseball game of revulsion and hatred, and the body language was, if you think we're spending 40 hours on a novel, guess again, Buster. And I know no one read it after that. They might have read it if I'd said maybe 4 or 5 hours, it'll be great. a few might have started and found their way through, but think of what it takes to read Light in August. Think of what it takes to read Moby Dick. Think of what it takes to read Anna Karenina or Crime and Punishment. We live in an age when the pace is so fast and the patience level and the commitment level is so low that we are in danger of collapsing in the great texts, reducing them to Cliff's Notes or beyond, to perpendicular entries into the internet for quick and dirty summaries of these things. And I'm not at all certain that the book will continue. We know that. There's a Barnes & Noble in every village in America now. The book is thriving in some regards, but it's not at all clear to me that literacy in any meaningful sense is thriving. And I think that's a very grave issue, because I don't know how you understand the nature of sexual obsession if you can't read Anna Karenina, or how you understand a young man's angst as he faces the improbabilities of the cosmos if you can't read Hamlet, and how you understand what revenge and friendship look like if you can't read the Iliad. And I think my own students, and they're no better or worse than any others, are showing an inability to come to terms with those texts. And not just an inability, an unwillingness to come to terms with those texts. And you can look at it either from a cynical point of view or a generous one, but I'm going to take the generous point of view. I don't think that this culture, through its educational system, through its families, through its popular culture, sends up to the college level people who are ready to face the great tradition any longer. And if they aren't ready to face the great tradition, and we continue to try to go about it in our institutions, that's bad pedagogy, and it's not facing the culture as it actually is. So I think we, in some regards, have reached the effective end to this tradition, and what's about to follow is going to be extraordinary, I don't doubt that. But whether it is a humanities-based future is a very different question. I don't think you get the same humanities depth and subtlety from watching the Andy Griffith Show, or Star Trek, or Northern Lights, or you name a fine piece of television, that you do from sitting alone in a room, teasing out the meaning and the symbolism and the language of a book, and allowing that to percolate, and looking up from time to time to daydream and to imagine what that character looked like, and then to look up a word or to go back and reread a sentence and to put it down and have a conversation with your friend or your lover and then go back to it and start again. I don't think our passive, visualized, post-literate culture that's emerging is going to be very good about the great tradition. Now, St. Augustine, at the beginning of this whole business, said he would consider himself well educated if he could read whatever he wanted to read, write whatever he wanted to write, and understand any concept that he wished to understand. Isn't that an amazing definition of education? Read any book you wanted to read. I can't say that of my students. They're not any longer able to do that. But my contemporaries, who were born after the war, on the whole still were capable of doing that, those who wanted to discipline themselves. Write what they wanted to write. You don't even need to be a composition teacher to know that this is a culture in deep, deep collapse in terms of lucidity. And understand what we want to understand, that's maybe where one could be more generous, because the world is now so breathtakingly complex that who would, besides you, attempt to describe what a computer chip is? But at any rate, I think there's something frightening about that. And I think that if we believe in the great tradition, that we should not blithely embrace the revolution that is coming. Or if there is a revolution coming that's beyond our control, we should attempt to shape it by insisting on certain norms. But perpendicular culture, where I'm interested in, suddenly, late at night, interested in discovering what the Odyssey is about, and instead of reading it, instead of even contemplating reading it, I go in perpendicularly into a website and pull out a graphic here and a summary statement there and a quotation here, and then call that the Odyssey. That, I think, is an inadequate approach to the cultural tradition. Finally, I just want to raise a question about authority. In a democratic culture like ours, we tend to be derisive of authority, but I'm not so sure we should be so quick about that. If it's the the world in which every individual decides for her or himself who God is and whether we adhere to God's word. And there is no intercessor, no priest, no mentor, no guide of any sort, then how do we police this in any meaningful way? John Hinckley, when he shot Ronald Reagan, claimed that he had been inspired directly by God. When David Koresh or Jim Jones created their own strange subcultures in faraway places, they claimed to be directly inspired by God, as did the San Diegans who took their life. It seems to me that in the humanities and in the great tradition of religion, some level of authority is useful, at least in prep, in mentoring. I mean, which of us would want to look back on our own mental development without acknowledging that there was a mentor there to serve as the filter, the guide, the discriminator between grossly wrong ideas and ones that were somehow in the zone of possible and correct ones? So it doesn't seem to me that we necessarily want a world without some authority in the way that the great tradition is passed on. I don't trust myself to take a field that I know nothing about. If I were going to study Eastern Orthodox Christianity, I would not trust myself to come to terms with this. I would go to someone I trust, like the Reverend Bill Crystal, and ask him preliminary questions so that my choices would be relatively good ones. But now, in the incredible fissuring of individualism and individual access to culture and religious traditions, there is a deliberate antagonism to the idea of authority of any sort, and I'm not certain that in the long run that does civilization much good. So finding a balance between liberty on the one hand and authority on the other, it seems to me, is one of the things that we need to face in the next century, and I think that we have too quickly and too smugly discarded the notion of authority as we face this future. At any rate, I had another couple of points that I wanted to make, but I will save them. I get all too much time to talk while I'm here, so I just want to say again to Tony Stewart, thank you very much, and we're all looking forward to tomorrow for another great day of Chautauqua. Thanks for coming.
I know you have found this a great treat this evening, and we'll continue tomorrow and Friday, and have a good evening.